Hello and welcome to the Royal Institute of British Architects. Who am I? Well, my name is Valerie Vaughan-Dick, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the RIBA. And I'm really happy to be here and open tonight's talk. Thank you everyone who's attended for joining this evening, because this is the first event in the autumn series of Forms of Exchange. We're really happy to host this event today, and we're doing that in partnership with our long-standing sponsors, VitrA, and we're grateful to them for their ongoing support. The partnership with VitrA has explored a wide range and survey of topics, projects, and innovative news ideas about the ways people are rethinking the relationship between the built environment and society. This relationship has seen a diverse range of thought-provoking lectures and discussions featuring emerging and established international voices within and across architecture. This collaboration reflects a shared commitment to add social, economic, and cultural value to society, and it's to inspire audiences, and this has been both in person, across the UK, and internationally, as well as digitally. Some of these lectures are available online, and if you check the RIBA+VitrA page on architecture.com, you can look back over the many great talks we have hosted over the past 5 years. Throughout 2023, the programme Forms of Exchange has invited a range of voices, and these are individuals who are leading the way with new processes and practices that are redefining placemaking and the architectural profession, and sharing the conversation around how architecture and a practice and profession is shifting. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome both architect Asif Khan and Matthew Blunderfield, and they're sitting there in the front. I'm going to say a bit about both of them. Asif Khan will present some of his recent projects developed by his London-based studio, and these range from buildings, landscapes, exhibitions, and installations. Khan's practice explores how material and social innovations can fundamentally alter the way people experience and shape their environment. After Khan's keynote presentation, he will be joined by Matthew Blunderfield, who will chair a conversation and manage any questions that people in this audience want to pose. So who is Matthew? Matthew is a photographer and host of Scaffold, a podcast and ongoing interview project that maps the shifting contours of contemporary architecture. He studied English literature at the University of British Columbia and architecture at the University of Toronto before completing his RIBA Part 3 qualification from the Bartlett, and has practiced architecture in Chengdu, London, and Toronto. Currently a producer at the Architecture Foundation, he teaches a diploma unit at the Royal College of Art. So, if we go back to Asif, because he's going to come on next, he established his studio in 2007, and he has built up a diverse portfolio, starting with a range of small-scale temporary projects, including pavilions, such as mega faces at the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics, which won the Cannes Lion Grand Prix for innovation, the Coca-Cola Beatbox at London 2012 Olympics. He designed the award-winning UK pavilion at Astana Expo in 2017, and the Hyundai Pavilion at the Pyeongchang 2018 Winter Olympics. He designed the 20-meter-high carbon fiber gates for the Dubai Expo in 2020, which has included 650 hectares of public realm that became a new quarter. He's also currently working on the new Museum of London at West Smithfield, which is due to be completed in 2026, and the Taslini Centre of Contemporary Culture in Almaty. Other larger-scale projects include the renewal of the Barbican Art Centre with Alice and Morrison, plus a redevelopment of Liverpool's Canning Dock area, and the recently announced project, which is the Museum of the Incense Robe, and that is in Saudi Arabia. Lots of other accolades, but I'll include a few. He was awarded an MBE for his services to architecture in 2017, and the studio was named Architects of the Year by the German Design Council in 2018. Asif also lectures globally on his work, and he sits on the board of trustees for the Design Museum. So after all of that, and without further ado, I will invite Asif Khan to the stage to share more about his work and practice. Asif, please come up.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for that very kind introduction. Hello, and thank you for joining me this evening. My name's Asif Khan. The question that I want to ask today is how will we live? What rituals will be part of our civilization? What materials will we build with? What will surround us? What could human well-being feel like? Will we be nomadic? What materials will we use? What objects will we travel with? Or will sit at our houses? And what is the impact of AI on the world? How do we survive? In my work, I use imagery, installations, cultural programming, exhibitions, and writing to explore these ideas. This is actually the human genome at a 0.1 font size. I collaborate with many people, from engineers and scientists to craftspeople and archaeologists. That is, people who look to the future and people who look to the past. And my practice is fundamentally about these questions. Today, I would like to speak to three aspects of my work. I'd like to begin with rituals and religion, which will also explore migration, heritage, and social topics. Next, I'll be speaking about time and the cosmos, in which I'll look to the infinite and the idea of the museum as a form of time machine. Finally, I would like to touch on world-making, gaming, and a little bit of magic, too. I was born in London in 1979. My parents were immigrants to the UK who moved here in the 60s and 70s. They met and married here. They still live in the same house where I grew up. My mum, Layla, who's behind the camera, is from Tanzania in East Africa, and my dad, Riaz, just there, is from Pakistan. Both mum and dad were social workers, and that's a photo of my dad at the Barbican Centre. Rituals became a major aspect of growing up, and they are for any immigrant family. These were things that made us different and yet fascinating. For my whole life, I was drawn to visit Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It's a magnetic draw, which is difficult to describe. In 2015, I had a chance to go. We communally partake in a whole series of rituals here. And these are other rituals, not at Mecca, but in my own practice, rituals involving water. In my work, these rituals seem to surround me. From my father's strand of Islam, I learned how to ritually wash before prayer. It's called wudu. And my mother's strand of Islam, they have a ritual where the congregation drinks from a communal water vessel as a form of purification. It's called Abishifa. And the opposite, when fasting during Ramadan, we become very careful not to drink any water at all. You develop a consciousness of the presence of even one single drop of water. We are submerged in water for the first 9 months of our lives, and water you could think of as the very first immersive sensory experience. We are also water mostly ourselves, and bathing is a process of water returning to water. When we drink water, the cycle completes itself. Our individual senses are stimulated by water, and it can be used visually. And the sound of running water, the glint of reflections on its surface, the unknown darkness of depth, a powerful wave, surface tension. When we bathe or swim in it, it literally immerses you. We can breathe its vapor. And water rituals are also sacred in Japan. And I've been traveling to Japan for 20 years, since I was 19 years old. My kids are half Japanese. They're not here today. I couldn't persuade them to come. My daughter on the right is now 17 years old, or she'll be 17 tomorrow. There are so many things that I absorbed from Japanese culture, and I think Japanese ritual and aesthetic culture brings with it a sense of sensory sensitivity to objects, textures, space between people, the use of words, subtle body movement, even movements of a millimeter. In particular, I've learned so much from my friend, the Japanese designer Kenya Hara. He's also the art director of Muji. From him, a way of thinking and seeing. And this is a project we collaborated on called Architecture for Dogs. This is a map Hara-san made to explain how Japan is a receiver and refiner of ideas from the rest of the Eurasian continent. So from Rome all the way to Tokyo. Hara is interested in there he is, Hara. Hara is interested in the idea of unlearning what we think we know. The less that we know, the more that we are open to new ideas. And that map there is just the map of the Eurasian continent twisted by 90 degrees, so gravity flows downwards. And he said all ideas flow downwards towards Japan. Japan connects me with another person and collaborator whom I find very interesting, the American artist Theaster Gates. Working with ceramics drew him to work in Japan, and he's coined the term Afro-Minge. To return to my parents, my mum Layla is from Tanzania in East Africa. The connection with East Africa is something which has always been there for me, and this is a mapping we made of the ceramics owned by Duke Franz of Bavaria for the African Ceramics exhibition at Denui Sammlung, which is the design museum in Munich. I'd been fascinated by Japanese ceramics for many years, but I'd never realized the equivalent and extraordinary perfection in vessels from the African continent. The highest level of human art and craftsmanship possible, in my opinion. Just to return to water, that map is also a map of African rivers, because all of the clay used in those pots is from riverbeds. The action of collecting the clay has ritualistic importance. Many of the vessels themselves are used to carry liquids we can drink. Our exhibition design at Denui Sammlung commissioned Tanzanian Makonde artist Ntuluma to make mounts for objects, and a South African video artist, Andy Makosi, to film a river where the clay came from, and that served as a backdrop of the river, a backdrop of the exhibition. This is my mum, my sister, and me at the Barbican Center. We would visit the Barbican Arts Centre on weekends from a few months after it opened in 1982. We never used the public programme. Sorry if people from Barbican are here. But there was lots of free things happening all the time. We would sit and play on the lakeside for hours. I think that the Barbican, and particularly the lakeside, is one of the greatest pieces of public realm in London, if not the world. It's the presence of water that makes it special. Of course, water pools and fountains are used in Islamic gardens to create serenity and as places for purification. My father told me that it reminded him of the Mughal-era Shalimar Gardens in Lahore, which is why he used to come here. It reminded him of home. Isn't that really interesting? In our competition interview for the Barbican, which we won a year ago, I told that story. And since then, I found out that Geoffrey Powell, one of the architects, was actually born in Bangalore, India, in 1920. And both Christopher Bon and Jean Chamberlain went to meet Geoffrey Bower in 1976 in India. It starts to point at an Eastern set of influences on the Barbican. It's also interesting to note that the Barbican is a word that's been used for centuries to describe this point on London's wall, but it has roots in Arabic. Barb means door or gate, and Khana means house. So this is the gatehouse to London. Today we're thinking about how the Barbican can move from feeling like an elite resort to being an asset for everyone, opening up the door to the house, as it were, to people who didn't feel like it was theirs. The opportunity to work on this masterpiece was a full circle from the 2-year-old self to my 42-year-old self. And I told my dad that we won the competition on the 40th anniversary concert that we visited, and the whole thing had begun with him. It was a very emotional moment. So I'm trying extra hard to make my children have experiences like this that can help them in their future lives. If you look to the night sky in this location 250 years ago on a clear spring night, you would see a version of what is depicted in this etching. This is a midnight sky at London above St. Paul's. This is me standing at Cape Canaveral in Florida in front of the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1988, which was the first shuttle to be put back on the launch pad after the Challenger disaster in 1987. At 7 years old, I realized that I could find the cosmos in a computer. I would spend entire days traveling between stars. For me, within this map, was my first awareness of infinite time and infinite space. This is a star field 4,000 years from the future that was mapped as it would be seen from Pyeongchang in South Korea. In this project, I wanted to reveal the cosmos to everyone, as though we had cut a hole in the bright blue sky. At Astana Expo in Kazakhstan, I was interested to make a more evolved exploration of time and space. I wanted to make tangible the relationships, the time and energy transfers between the beginning of the universe, the formation of the sun, life on Earth, and finally human beings. The visitors that came to the exhibition would be an outcome of that energy flow. The pavilion began with a black room and a single note of music. It was a score created by one of my collaborators on the project, the incredible artist Brian Eno, and was accompanied by words by the astrophysicist Dr. Catherine Hymans. The black space symbolized the beginning of our universe at the time, which at the time it was thought to be 13.8 billion years ago. A corridor took visitors towards a film of the sun captured by the NASA Solar Dynamics Laboratory, which appeared over 4.5 billion years ago. This is my wife visiting the exhibition. And finally, it brought people to Earth at some moment in the human era, which was depicted in the form of a landscape. The sound increases complexity in the corridor until it reaches the Earth as a 24-channel continuous score that Brian made, dispersed around the center of the space. Moving around, every visitor has an entirely unique and personal experience of the soundscape. At the center, it was a continually running computer-generated simulation of 24 hours on Earth, 24 hours passing every 4 minutes. it means sunrise would take about 30 seconds. So every 2 days in the pavilion was a year of time. And it took the form of a landscape panorama measuring 50 meters long and projected with 24 projectors. Weather systems, millions of trees, all of those were rendered. And the center was a reinterpretation of a Kazakh nomadic yurt. The structure, which I chose to serve as an archetype of a form of environmentally tuned architecture that I believe civilization might eventually return to. Lightweight, transportable, multi-generational, and symbolic. The archetype here appeared in crystalline form, and the structure responded to touch with light. The same touch also affected the kind of day that was depicted in the unfolding landscape around visitors. There were two possible types of day and night in the film, a good day or a stormy day. And I put in place a decision-making tree, which the computer followed. A kind of virtual dice was rolled at the end of every day, and a day of mild weather was more likely to lead to another mild day. But with human interactions, it created a bias in the structure, linking the environment with the human beings themselves. So that experience of being in a world with its own time base and its own rule base. At the same time, each visitor and the miracle of their existence was due to the star at the center of the piece. Both the film and yurt were created to be of ambiguous origin. They could be from the past or the future. Actually, I attended the Prince's Foundation for a year when I was 19, and the first exercise we created on the first day of school was to make a yurt, but I'll come back to that later. And for Kazakhs, the yurt, and I'll move on to this image in a second, but for Kazakhs, the yurt is the center of the yurt, the Shanarak, is widely seen as a portal to the cosmos. So a yurt is a microcosm. The whole journey for that pavilion is a circular journey from the beginning of time, the cosmos, to the earth and back to the cosmos. So this circularity just keeps coming back in my work, and this diagram is something I produced for the Museum of London competition back in 2016. It's not the physical plan of the museum as it is today, but it gives you a sense of how I approach thinking about things. Such a diagram, I think, could be used to think about any new museum, or just to help us think about time. So to help you navigate it, there are two chronological routes from the present. One moves forwards in time to the future, and one moves back in time to the past. The most clear points are at the present. But as we move around the circle, things start to get a little more blurry. The possible future is a place where we start to rely on conjecture, whereas the near future we can pretty much work out. At the top of the drawing is pure imagination, unconstrained by past and future. We imagined a museum more like one of the first city universities. If you know about those, they were formed to solve the problems of the day. So it might be a legal problem, a problem of agriculture, a problem of water, a problem of war. Museums haven't been used to create ideas for the future, but we had this idea that the Museum of London could be the first. Instead of only being a vessel for the past and present, it could also incubate ideas for the future of the city. And this was just a diagram to suggest what the walls of the museum could contain. So the idea was to transform Smithfield General Market into more of an incubation space. Smithfield General Market, because there are a number of buildings are part of the scheme, has been the focus of my studio's work for the past few years. It has 47 shop fronts wrapped around a covered market square, and this is one corner of that sort of zoomed in. We've converted those shop fronts into a ring of 12 houses, which a museum can invite other entities to be part of. And this is just an idea, speculatively, of what kind of entities they could be. So this idea of the museum of the 21st century emerges, that rather than it being a singular institute, it's more like a coral reef. Secondly, that it has an architecture which allows multiple voices and changes over time. This is the only city museum in the world, I think, whose facade will always be a piece of changing city. And we've been working this for 7 years now, and I'm not going to spoil the surprise. You'll have to wait another 2 more years to find out about the project. But this just gives you a sense of that external street and the kind of things that can happen on the inside of it. It really will be a new public space for London and London's ideas. So I'm going to return to the Arabian world. After visiting Mecca, I'd been wanting to further explore my identity and connections with Saudi Arabia and that whole region. And the Museum of the Incense Road project has given me a chance to go back. This is Al-Ula. It's a place that we're working. This is a funerary building built by the Nabateans around 3,000 years ago. Al-Ula is a station on the Incense Road. It was described by Herodotus in 400 BC, and it was thought to be active for as long as 7,000 years. This small North Arabian town is connected to the prehistorical global route between East and West, moving ingredients of incenses, the most valuable commodities on Earth at the time, connecting Japan at one end to India, Arabia, the Holy Land, Egypt, Rome, and even as far as Britain. So this was globalization before we imagine it happened. And we all have personal associations with sense, but the idea that this intangible thing is one of the most important human experiences, and it's often used to help us perceive God. And that thing is shared by civilizations globally, and it has been from the dawn of time. To me, that idea is just simply extraordinary. It's a feeling of the cosmos being brought to the hearth. Al-Ula is a place at the center of that global story. And the frankincense and myrrh, which we all know was brought to Jesus, the baby Jesus. I said in the competition interview, which was at Christmas by coincidence, that probably that myrrh passed through Al-Ula on its way to Bethlehem. So our approach for this project is to build a museum which you may not even realize you're walking through. It will serve as a series of spaces for the education and use by the community by day, but life happens in this region by night when it's cooler. So my idea is that museum, the Museum of the Incense Road, could be the world's first night museum. Much of the experience will be outdoor, and travelers along the route because travelers along the route historically would have navigated by stars at night, and I want to make that experience somehow tangible to bring the past to the present. So you'll hear more about this in the future, but it's just a taste of where we're going with it. I just mentioned Jesus, and this circular form might be familiar as appearing in all of the iconography of Jesus, particularly in the Orthodox world. This is actually something called a parhelia, and it's thought to be the atmospheric phenomenon behind the halos that we see painted around religious figures, such as Jesus and Buddha. We created the world's first indoor ice halo in the cold chamber at the University of Manchester at -20 degrees some years ago, and then explored this light phenomenon in an installation which had a single LED at the center. I found even a tiny amount of light was able to bring people together in a way they didn't expect. I later explored the human face as a vehicle for amplifying empathetic sensations at 2 scales of magnitude above normal. This project involved over 100,000 participants being 3D scanned and gently took on and transmitted the forms of their expressions to the local environment and via the internet to the world. This is Life, a program created by the British mathematician John Conway in 1992. It was another very important computer program which had an impact on me as a 12-year-old. It's a simulation of life. It's called a cellular automata. Radiant Lines, a project I did, I think now 8 years ago, is a form of life simulation using light. Here it was situated at the center of Federation Square in Melbourne. Its LiDAR sensor detects people's presence and translates their being to lines of light which appear as persistent circling entities in a new world, creating illumination for the next generation of visitors who come to the square, even after they've gone. Life, or the marks made upon the places, are extended. Unlike the game of life, the entities do not have the ability to reproduce new generations. My interest was about extending or stretching the sensation of a person's presence in a place. From virtual worlds to physical world making, I've had the opportunity to think about what world making means for 3 world expos. Joseph Paxton's work in 1851, just down the road, has always been an influence, and probably is a progenitor of all glass and steel buildings in the world, along with Buckminster Fuller, his work on Montreal, and Kenzo Tange and the work of the metabolists on Osaka Expo. But we mustn't forget the structures of Vladimir Shukov in Russia either. But this map of all world expos points out something else when we created it. It's actually the absence of the African continent, the absence of South America, and until 2017 and 2020, the absence of the Middle East, South Asia, and Central Asia in that global story. It's not to say that their goods were absent from expos, but it was a one-directional exchange. So when the UAE had the opportunity to host Expo, after all these years, for me, it was important to make sure that their version of the future that was presented was born from the region and not a reproduction of the West. As is so much of the architecture that has been built there is built by Western architects in their own vision. So I imagined at the beginning of the journey a folded mashrabiyah as the first things visitors would pass through. It was a futuristic interpretation of what is a sophisticated regional architectural element. It's an element that mediates airflow, sunlight, and provides privacy. It's a glowing beacon at the entrance to Expo. It's a portal, a gateway that's ritually opened every morning. And closed every night. So it's the idea of lightness, but it's born not only from the tradition and the structural lineage of Paxton to Vladimir Shukov and Kenzo Tange, but it's born from the region. The portal, or you could call it a Barbican, if you will. It leads onto an arrival courtyard, which is a collection of, which within is a collection of specially selected plants, citrus fruit, medicinal plants, which give fragrance and life, and each have their own story. Now, ideas and goods have flowed along the region's sands for thousands of years, and I wanted these tracks in the landscape that were made by people to be present in the 6 kilometers of public realm. Planting, seating, and water features that I was asked to create. It was an entire world. The miniature details in local weaving suggested to me a language, a textural weave. So we looked to create surfaces that would include everyone of all physical abilities. The surfaces range from soft to textural to hard. And the idea of a place suggesting walking or moving at different speeds, but all in one shared space. With a simple palette of bricks, we created a sense of place that was unique. And I worked with the typographer Lara Kaptan from Lebanon to develop a suite of furniture which showcased the Arabic written language, and it's an art form that's threatened by the advent of digital technology. The handwritten word in Islam, in Islamic countries, is so important because we have no figurative art form. So this is calligraphy, and the work of the hand is everything. So we're going to come a bit closer to home. Liverpool is a city on the water, has an incredible, extraordinary, complex history. And some of the stories in Liverpool are very troubling for people to deal with, even today. When you stand on our site in Liverpool, at Canning Dock, you're not only surrounded by some of the greatest museums in the country, but you're surrounded by the history of Liverpool itself. During the 19th century, Liverpool was home to the busiest and wealthiest port in the world. By the early 19th century, 40% of the world's trade passed through Liverpool's docks, contributing to Liverpool's rise as a major city. But between 1695 and 1807, 5,300 voyages to West Africa by slaving ships from Liverpool had taken place, carrying over 1.5 million enslaved African men, women, and children to the Americas. At least 10% would die on the way, and many more in the years to follow. In the 1790s, Liverpool controlled 80% of the British slave trade and over 40% of the European slave trade. Working with the American artist Theaster Gates, our project at Canning Dock will treat the site as an outdoor museum, something operating outside of the traditional museum space. In this way, it has no thresholds. Canning Dock is called by local historian Lawrence Westgaff as the ground zero of transatlantic slavery. We're making the site accessible and safe, and then providing a way of getting down into the dock itself, a place that many thousands of ships, including slave ships, were once prepared for voyage. In the center, we're creating a very simple space made from stone and cast glass blocks. It symbolizes the physical volume of a slave ship. We use stacked stone, so the structure itself will last as long as the dock itself. We think around 500 years. It symbolizes the physical volume of a slave ship, as you can see in this image, but it's inverted. The 15,000 glass blocks bring light into the space and refract the light into color. This is the light carried from our nearest star. This will be a space for people to come together for spoken word, music, performance, rather than being a space for only hearing about the past. It's a space for listening to each other and moving forward together. It's a space for healing. It's a space where light brings us together. Thank you.
I was just frantically writing notes the whole time. I feel like this was a real odyssey you took us on through all kinds of projects at all kinds of scales, from the microscopic to the cosmic, we could say, and also setting us in a state of mind that asks us to balance between two polarities. One is the material world, and the other is the spiritual. And I found it really moving and compelling to be, I guess, in a house of architecture and asked to hold these two things together simultaneously. It's not something that's asked of us as architects that often. So thank you, first of all, for that. The post-colonial scholar Homi Bhabha has this statement that in-betweenness is a fundamental condition of our times. And to me, your practice, as well as your identity, is very much in between different cultures, different identities. So I wanted to start by asking you, where is home?
That's a great question. Well, it's something which is certainly, London is part of who I am. And I grew up here, I went to university here, I have so many friends here, but I found through family And I mentioned, my kids are half Japanese, my wife is Kazakh, I have a Dutch aunt, I have a Swedish aunt, we are somehow, and this is maybe by being a group of immigrants to this country at a certain moment in time where people were open to self-transformation and looking for that, that the kind of horizons of the world appeared to be limitless. And I think the kind of first steps in that were taken by my parents. And I feel at home in every project I get involved in. I say project because projects are very much a personal journey, and I take on the projects in these unusual places around the world to expand my identity and to connect with people and places in new ways, but on a very personal level. So I find myself being at home in Almaty in Kazakhstan. I find myself being at home in Russia when we did these projects in Sochi. I found myself being at home in Miami, and it's quite nice weather there as well. But or in South Africa when we were there. So there's a constellation of places that I feel like I'm home in. And it's interesting, the ones which are in the Middle East and the kind of the region of Islamic countries, because they're places which I've come to through work, but have connected to aspects of my identity which were kind of lost in the move and lost in the process of assimilation into Western culture and kind of I think into London culture in some ways. So through those projects, I'm slowly unpeeling and accessing parts of me and my sort of genome that I was shying away from and almost sometimes embarrassed by. So yeah, I'm taking the home everywhere I go, basically. Yeah.
There's this, people will be familiar with the architectural historian Mark Wigley, who's written a lot about Jorn Utzon and the kind of alienation of architects like Utzon and how productive that sense of estrangement often is for architects who are often finding themselves and finding their best work outside of where they're from. And so, I don't know, to me I'm drawn to this sense of self-discovery through making work, but also the sensation that I know you've articulated before around not necessarily feeling like you belong in the culture that you find yourself in here, and specifically the culture of architecture, if we could call it that, the culture of London architecture in particular. I mean, I came to you and your work through an understanding that you are a maker of pavilions and of a participant in world expositions. And so immediately I think of designers like Charles and Ray Eames. I think, of course, of the Metabolists as well. And I think of the kind of elastic nature of the discipline, that architecture is actually quite an expanded field that involves all kinds of media, all kinds of contributions. And so maybe this brings us to the question of, are you even an architect? I know the answer is no. Technically, no. Neither am I. And yet, I think the people that you most admire and this kind of tradition of world making first through the scale of the pavilion is at the heart of the architectural project. So how do you situate yourself, in this context? Where is the tradition that you're following, or is that even important?
I think there are I follow different strands, and I mentioned. I mean, the work of the Metabolists is something I also mentioned, particularly at that moment in 1970 where things really came together, and we're still borrowing from those ideas to sort of frame what the world looks like today. I think those things have been important to me. Actually, I have such a broad range of interests, and I didn't present them all today to you because I think it's like a 1 hour, 10-hour lecture. And it's sort of irresistible to me to be interested in physics and chemistry and mathematics and languages and social history and material science. I mean, these are the makings of what I think are good architecture and an interesting world ahead of us. And all of those subjects, you know, all the arts and all the sciences are where I situate myself. And I find that, and I showed some computer games there. I mean, Elite, which is a game that, if some of you are old enough, you may have played, I think is one of the greatest works of art ever created. It's just extraordinary. It was made in 1984. Like, all of these things sort of take me, give me the tools to kind of go forward in my practice. Yeah, my practice isn't a traditional form of practice, but I think traditional practice is something doesn't really exist, but it's something we're falling into the trap of becoming. So I think traditional practice, the idea of traditional practice is sort of this thing that is sort of an inevitable process. It's highly commercial. Everything makes sense. It's done in a way that is today quite led by project management and the kind of limits of computation and so on. But I think the kind of architecture or the kind of work that I want to produce is personal work, you know, fundamentally. But I think all great forms of art and all great architecture is personal. So I think that's the thing that I'm trying to promote through my work, or that I can't escape, is making the work some reflection of myself. And that's something that I would love to see more of in London. The London scene is work where the work is a vehicle for a person's way of thinking about the world.
Staying with that point, I think this kind of incumbent generation of architects and young practices are feeling like there are necessary boundaries that need to be established between one's sense of self and one's work. I'm really interested in that because it's a tension that I imagine a lot of architects of a certain age in the room will be coming up against, that there's a different approach or attitude towards work and what it means personally now. And so how do you grapple with that? If on the one hand, the work is a kind of embodiment of one's identity, and for it to be of any quality, it needs to be somehow, but at the same time, we're being asked to, in a way, disconnect or remove ourselves, our identities from the work we do. So I'm curious, you know, what your reflections on that discrepancy are, that kind of tension, generationally speaking.
I think it's very interesting, the discussion that's happening, but I think there are two things happening. One is the awakening of the importance of the users of buildings to the process of making buildings. Like, that's something great, and I mean, it's something that's always been part of my work, to understand who you're making things for, and to try to include lessons that you've learned from them, service them better. Right? This is really important for all architecture. But to remove yourself from the picture and to make the whole project purely about participation or purely about the user is, I think, neglecting your kind of professional responsibility to use everything you've learned and everything that you've worked hard at university to try and absorb, and every reference that you've brought from around the world to the project. So it's sort of, I think what I don't want to, what I'm concerned about is where design has disappeared to. And I think participation isn't a replacement for design. and design thinking and design quality and design meaning, we've still got to continue to build an extraordinary civilization about why are we here. And I think that's sort of incumbent on everyone who picks up a pencil or a mouse, or to try to achieve the best they can and improve upon the previous generation's work.
It's interesting because it sounds like, what I was asking about was the internal culture of practice, but where you went to me is more interesting, which is the external perception of architecture. And the kind of heightened demand of the architect to, crucially, to listen. And that somehow feels at odds with this need for authorship, this need for, this is maybe the wrong word, but this kind of heroic understanding of what architecture can be. And if we look at institutions like the Barbican, it's a kind of case in point. At the same time, this uncanny historical layer that you revealed in the kind of flickering between the Barbican and the gardens of Lahore, between Bond's, I think, birth in India, between these between these kind of hidden elements of this everyday monument in the city, totally exploded it for me and opened it up to this broader, much more heterogeneous understanding of what I always thought was a monolith. Even in the etymology of the name Barbican and its Arabic roots. So I think, to me, what was so exciting about the presentation is that you're trying to reveal, I think, a kind of heterogeneity that was always there from the beginning. But it's a kind of unanswered question. How do you grapple with authorship in projects that demand more contribution, that demand more listening, that demand, in a way, less of the architect and his identity and more of the community that he or she or they are building for?
I think let's explore it a bit. I mean, in this project, for example, we've worked with 3 amazing community groups, Squash Liverpool, Writing on the Wall, and 20 Stories High. And they are local community groups in Toxteth. And although we put pen to paper in the competition early stages, that was sort of put on the side, and we began a process of listening and understanding of the local community. And it really demanded it, because as I'd said in the talk, it's a very complex site with a lot of histories which are even contested by the local community, by different parts of the local community. So you've got to sort of understand there what is the desire, where does it stand, where are the low-hanging fruit, and what are the things that are challenging that people have always wanted to do there but have never managed to achieve that. So to understand that it's a kind of form of survey is really important, and we still bring that group with us in all of our design processes. Like it's a continuous process. But I see the architect's role. I mean, I think the word heroic is used really extensively, but I don't think it's not how I've ever seen. Particularly if I author something, it's not to be a hero or something. I see myself as a kind of guide, like someone taking people up a mountain, or someone taking people on an extraordinary journey. The guide is not the hero. The guide is just making it safe for you to explore those places, and the place that you wouldn't necessarily go to by yourself. And the form of the tour, it can be very unique to that guide. Like we went on a trip to Kazakhstan and went to the desert in the western Kazakhstan. But there are lots of, this is a few months ago, there are lots of tourist guides offering this trip, and I highly recommend it. It's a place called Mangostau, enormous ancient sea. But we went with a guide who was a Sufi, and he took us on a trip charting the introduction of Islam to the Western Kazakhstan 1,000 years ago. And we went from mosque to mosque, experiencing, I think, transcendental landscapes and spiritual places with him. So he wasn't the hero. The landscape was the hero, and actually the narrative that was there was the hero. And but it was all about a world that was unlocked for us by this person. And I massively venerate him. He's amazing, and all of this. But it's not about him. You have to see beyond him. It's about the environment that was created and the experiences by the people who followed him. I think that's the role of an architect in that position, or an artist, or a great musician, is to lead people into some territory that they never imagined possible. You know, in the end, particularly with music, and I play a lot of different instruments, and it's a very important part of my life. It's not about necessarily the author of the music. Once you're playing, it becomes yours. You know, and I think that's similar in a great piece of architecture. You know, in the end, you're not thinking about the guys who built the Barbican. You're thinking about sitting there with your family and the gardens in Lahore. And in fact, we don't even know who built the gardens in Lahore, the Shalimar Gardens. We know they're Shah Jahan, and we know there's the kind of bigger picture who commissioned them. We don't know who the architect was, or the Taj Mahal even. That's probably what will happen to these things in the future.
It's a humbling standpoint to take, to imagine the relative anonymity of us all right now in the present to future generations. And one that I think oddly enriches the idea of practice, or the practice of architecture.
Yeah, because you can get it wrong. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be perfect. You can actually experiment, because in the end, it's just something in the city. I mean, I sorry I interrupted you.
No.
Experimentation is really, I think, the responsibility.
To me, the practice is such an embodiment of the contemporary. To me, it's even in the ways it doesn't quite fit, and maybe because of them. And I want to close just with this this insight from the philosopher George Agamben, who, speaking about contemporaneity, about the contemporary, says that those who are truly contemporary are those who neither perfectly coincide with their time nor adapt to its demands. Contemporaneous, then, is that relationship with time that adheres to it through its disconnection. And I really see that in your work. So I just want to thank you again, Asif, for the presentation. And please join me again in just thanking Asif.
Thank you.
So now we'll open up to audience questions.
Hello, thanks very much. I hadn't expected this. So with a bit of surprise, I was looking through each piece of work and thinking, where's the center? And at one point, everybody's got an idea, I'm sure, of what they got as a center. But I listened to the point when you mentioned the calligraphy. And the calligraphy being so necessary because of lack of formal imagery. And it got me to think about imagery as a decorative part of architecture. It's not just the roof details and the amazing structural shapes we make, but the decoration that historically has been part of architecture. And so I was wondering if you could comment, if such a thing is possible, on the connection between that calligraphic statement, meaningful calligraphy, and the role of, if any, your architecture has with decoration.
Let me just have a think about that. So the relationship between the non-figurative use of calligraphy and the role of decoration in my work. Let's see.
It's a bit of a doozy, that one.
It's an interesting question. I'm just. I don't tend to use the word decoration. Decoration is a. I mean, A lot of architects don't use that word. But it's really important to making a place feel inhabitable and friendly.
I just feel like there's maybe a way in here that has to do with this discrepancy between analog and digital culture. I mean, calligraphy is all about the hand. And you started, your education in design began with craft work, with this Prince's Foundation experience you had, working with stone, with timber, drawing by hand. And so I think the question about decoration maybe becomes relevant when we talk about the tools you use now and how they affect the expression or the aesthetic of the work.
Okay, that's a good framing. Yeah, maybe the thing that I've been thinking about is like the portals in Dubai, and the Mashrabiyah is seen by the West as a decorative feature, actually, and it was seen as just like this thing that made a set or an environment feel Eastern or Arabic, and it had that kind of power. But it's an entirely functional thing. It's for airflow, it's for shading, it's for privacy. So I think this is like an interesting place where function starts to become decoration. And here, say function, which is the stacking of stones, and light, the penetration of light, it begins to become part of the kind of aesthetic language of something. So like to go a bit further into the Prince's Foundation, I learned to do stone carving, I learned to do welding, I learned to do inscription, everything by hand, wooden joint making. I got really into Japanese joinery, have Japanese saws and chisels, and like it was quite strange to move to doing things on the computer, but now because of my kind of childhood playing with computers, I feel like equally adept with those two worlds and drawing by hand and so on. We're going through a kind of a process where labor is the biggest challenge in the kind of construction process, and labor, when it was cheap, allowed for great deals of decoration in everywhere. Like this room is reasonably well kind of detailed and decorated, but it's there's a limit which is given by the cost of labor, right? It's quite interesting when computer-controlled manufacturing starts to become more present, and like seriously, we'll start to get buildings made entirely by robots not very far in the future. It'll be interesting to see whether it's a chance to kind of rejuvenate the kind of details that come about through craft. And through working with materials with an extraordinary detail. So I'm not quite sure where it will go, but there's an opportunity there to revive that. And the kind of remarkable thing about decoration is it gives you this, particularly like the portals, they give you a sort of sense of a place. So I don't know where that will open up, but it's kind of minimalism is kind of it's funny anyway. Minimalism is very expensive to achieve, actually, but which is unexpected. But it is the kind of opposite, and now it's probably time that it bounces back and we find some new language. But it's an interesting question, but I can't go into it further.
Great. It was a great talk, Asif. Fantastic. Just talk a little bit more about the Barbican, maybe. I loved how you brought it. It was your childhood memory, and as one of the shortlisted teams that didn't win, I'm really curious also, because you collaborate with so many different people and in different contexts. But for instance, the Barbican, collaborating with Allies and Morrison, really big firm. Talk a little bit more about that, and perhaps weave that into the Museum of London, which we're all really looking forward to, and collaborating with the big team that you've
Stanton
got there.
Williams.
So, Stanton Williams.
So I mean, to begin with that, Stanton Williams, Julian Harrop, and ourselves with a competition team for Museum of London. That was back in 2016. At the time, although we weren't a small practice, but we were not as experienced with any projects involving kind of working with heritage assets. And Julian obviously is, the most experienced, one of the most experienced in the world, and he just finished the Noyce Museum. And Stanton Williams also been working on very large scale, not as big as, no one had worked on anything as big as the Museum of London, but they'd worked on just finishing off a big museum in Nantes. So I think we all brought different things to the table, and this collaboration is something we've all had to work quite hard on over time to ensure that we keep, that we can keep together on the journey and keep learning from each other and making the process really, really fun. And it's gone through with our teams. We've gone through like 2 generations of team members. You sort of, as you move through the stages, and part 1s have gone back to university and come back as part 2s and continue working on it, or say, well, I've had enough Museum of London, I want to do something else. It's now been 7 years. And the teams are working really well together. And I think when we applied for the Barbican competition, that 7 years of experience had put us in quite a different place. And so we moved from being beginners at that in that process to being sort of experts at it, or like at least in a position where when we collaborated with Allies and Morrison, we brought so much more to the table. It's a different, obviously it's a museum, it's a building from a different period, but the similarity is, firstly, it's a few hundred meters down the road, and that I didn't go into that in the presentation, but that area is really going to transform over time, and that's another part of our kind of interest in the 2 of them, is what happens in between and how we connect that new part of London up. But the second thing they have in common is the number of stakeholders involved. So from having large boards, Barbican has 4,000 residents. The Museum of London has, several million people, a million school kids or so, 7 million objects. There's millions and millions and millions of things, but they all have very large footprints. And I think what we learned in the process is the ability to once think on this personal level and have personal relationships with curators and heads of art departments, heads of music, head of theatre and so on, but at the same time bring that personal approach to a project with hundreds of people involved, hundreds of consultants, engineers, one of them sitting in the room in front of me, Hanif Kara. So having all of these people, making sure they can go along the journey with you. That was, I think, what we've brought to the table. And I think also, now that we've grown and when we came together with Allies and Morrison, we were able to, I think, meet more as peers. And I think obviously Allies has like 500 people, and they have just extraordinary experience in this type of project. But we're also coming with experience. So it's very nice to have transformed ourselves through the process of those 2 projects. And what's also interesting is that we found that other museums around the world, particularly who are involved in the reuse of old buildings, are coming to us and sort of want a little bit of those things, but they want to make it for themselves. And that's also quite an interesting thing to be involved in.
I'm curious if there are any students in the room, also anybody, but I know there's often an inhibition from younger members of the audience, but definitely welcome you to.
There's a student here, a lifelong student.
Okay, there was someone with their hand there first. Should we do that? And then you've got the mic. Let's go with you.
Okay, I've got the mic. Is it working? Yes. Well, having spent the whole day in the Barbican today, how on earth do you marry up protection from historic England and the ability to get around the building? Because the AHMM scheme failed miserably to actually sort out those problems. What are you going to do to solve the problem that everybody goes to the Barbican complains about?
So The Barbican's a very large place. It's actually, if you look at the Arts Centre in a plan, it's larger than the British Museum. It's just extraordinarily large. But we don't realise it from the outer walls. And it's surrounded by an enormous number of members of the public and people living in that area in London who don't really know that it exists. And it is wonderful to live in the Barbican, but only 4,000 people can live in the Barbican. A lot of us would love to. But the idea of why it was created and what it's servicing, and it being this art centre for, as well as the residences, the art centre for that part of London, I think has been challenged by the architecture itself over time. Like it hasn't, the inability to get in and to get out even when you finish a performance. And that's not so good for the residents either, because it can be noisy at night. So one of the mantras we brought to the competition was to not build an extra square meter. It's kind of important because the building's an icon already and it doesn't need more iconic architecture on it. However, there's a great amount of space in there which is underused or not used at all. So what we're going to be trying to do is to unpick those spaces, connect them in new ways, remove some floor plates which are not doing anything, making it possible for the different art forms in the Barbican to make better use of the building, and upgrading kind of the performance of it for energy, so it's up to date. But if you come there in a wheelchair, as you're sort of mentioning, Peter, it's pretty much impossible to get in the same way that able-bodied users can. So what we're trying to figure out is new routes within the Barbican that can connect up places in new ways of getting to levels, between levels. But what's also great when we do that is we're creating experience of the Barbican that people haven't necessarily had before. We're discovering things. We're looking into all of the old drawings and pastel renderings and finding ideas which were on, Chamberlain, Powell and Bond's sort of drawing table, but they didn't have the money to do at the time, or they just thought, well, that's not useful right now. But there are so many kind of clues in there about a Barbican that could have been, that I think over the coming years we'll start to explore those and share those with everyone. Again, it's a whole lecture, but we'll do an exhibition in the Barbican itself as we start to get further along the road. I think English Heritage will be very happy to see what we end up doing there, because I think we'll by looking backwards into the history of the place and unpicking some of the changes that have been made over time, like some of the work that's gone on there in the past 10, 20, 30 years, we'll be able to move forward into the future with it. So it's a backward step and then a forward step. But it's something really exciting, the transformation that will happen.
Hi, thank you for the amazing presentation. So actually, I can see that you take very specific material like carbon fiber and you're using it in a very collaborative way. So this collaboration part I know is very critical to the architecture process, but yet as architect and even when I have practiced, like it feels like it's one of the hardest part to do it. So can you give from your experience like some on your journey, like what you have learned that makes this collaboration process very seamless for other people who are in the process of this?
Thank you. It's been part of the process since the beginning. And actually, I have a whole group of my collaborators here in the room who are part of the studio. The studio is a collaborative process itself. So it begins at home. I've always searched for expertise in fields that where I realize the limits of my knowledge and want to work with the best in those areas. And whether it's going to be in material science or engineering or some, or artists or in this case, we're working with an incredible stonemason and a glass casting company. It's like we bring those people to the table, and they, in a way, the ask to them has to be something extraordinary. It has to be that you're trying to push them to the limits of what they know, and then they feel it's worth working on something. It's worth, it's not a humdrum thing that we're going to get them out of their laboratory for. It's something that's going to expand their world and their horizons, and provide new meanings for them. So I think this is a thing that we all share in common when we collaborate with others. Lara Kaptan had never done something out of the 2D world. So the project was the lettering and the calligraphy in three dimensions, and she had never done anything off a piece of paper or on a computer, and now it was 50 meters long. So it's completely transformed the potential of language for her, because it meant that we could, that's just one example. We were able to explore what we called the spatial linguistic experience, and that is like if you're sitting on an Arabic word which means togetherness, what form could that bench take that would encourage togetherness through the way the Arabic is written? This is something she'd never explored, and you don't need to explore on paper, but you can explore it when you're working 3 dimensions. So this is something that we were able to do. And another example, Dr. Catherine Hymans, she's an incredible astrophysicist. She's working on dark energy at the University of Edinburgh, but she hadn't been given the opportunity to communicate her science and her understanding of the universe to a huge population outside of writing papers. And I said to Catherine, like, could you tell me the history of the universe in like 3 lines? And so she was removing letters and this. So we got this incredibly short and precise, the most precise. It's like E equals MC squared of the birth of the universe, haiku. And that was the most perfect way, and the perfect kind of, like say, philosophical scoring that would go along with Brian Eno's music, and it would go along with kind of my physical work and the film work that I did. So this is what we try to do when we bring people to the table, to really make amazing things together, so it's worthwhile doing it. So that's what I encourage in the collaborations you seek out, is to stretch people, and then amazing things come out through the collaboration.
Okay, we're good.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.